There's a stretch of ocean at the bottom of the world where ships have been vanishing for 400 years, where sailors described waves taller than a 6-story building, and where an entire squadron of the British Navy once lost more men to a single crossing than most battles of that century combined. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what made this stretch of water so lethal, why the men who tried to cross it kept getting it catastrophically wrong for centuries, and what actually happened to the ones who didn't make it through. Some of it is stranger and darker than almost anyone expects. Let's get into it. The water with no land to stop it. At the very bottom of South America, past the last scattered islands of Tierra del Fuego, the world simply runs out of continents. What's left in that gap between Cape Horn and the icy edge of the Antarctic Peninsula is a stretch of open ocean roughly 600 miles wide, known as the Drake Passage. And the reason it earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous crossings on Earth has almost nothing to do with rocks or reefs. It has to do with the fact that there is nothing there at all. Everywhere else on the planet, wind blowing across the ocean eventually runs into something. A coastline, an island chain, a landmass that breaks it up and slows it down. At the latitude of the Drake Passage, there's no such obstacle anywhere on Earth. The wind can circle the entire globe from west to east without ever touching solid ground, gathering strength the whole way, funneling directly through this one open gap between two continents. Meteorologists sometimes describe it as the closest thing on the planet to a wind tunnel with no walls, a place where a storm system can build for thousands of uninterrupted miles before it ever reaches a ship unlucky enough to be caught underneath it. Sailors gave these latitudes their own names, and the names alone tell you what to expect. Around 40 degrees south, it's the Roaring Forties. Push further down to 50 degrees and it becomes the Furious 50s. Go further still into the Drake Passage itself and you're in the Screaming 60s. Each name marks a region where the wind gets progressively less forgiving, and by the time you're through all three, you're in some of the most violent weather patterns anywhere on the planet. Underneath all of that wind, the water itself is moving too. The Drake Passage happens to be the one narrow gap where the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, the single largest ocean current on Earth, gets squeezed through a relatively tight space. That current alone moves more water than every river on the planet combined, many times over, flowing endlessly around Antarctica because nothing is in its way to stop it. Forced through this narrower gap, it accelerates, colliding with cold water pushing up from the south and warmer water pushing down from the north, all funneling through the same 600-mile-wide stretch of sea. The result is a body of water that can produce waves regularly reaching 40 to 50 feet during storms, with some captains over the centuries reporting walls of water closer to 60 or even 80 feet high, a wave taller than a 6-story building, rising up out of open ocean with nothing to break its momentum before it does. There's also a collision happening beneath the surface that has nothing to do with wind at all. Cold water pushing up from the Antarctic side of the passage meets noticeably warmer water pushing down from the sub-Antarctic side, and the boundary where they meet, known as the Antarctic Convergence, is sharp enough that ships crossing it have recorded the surrounding air and sea temperature drop several degrees within a matter of hours. That collision of temperatures churns nutrients up from the deep ocean floor, feeding the plankton and krill that in turn draw whales, seabirds, and colonies of penguins to this stretch of water in extraordinary numbers. The very same turbulence that made this passage so lethal for sailing ships is also what makes it one of the most biologically rich stretches of ocean on the planet. And for nearly 300 years, if you wanted to sail between the Atlantic and the Pacific, this was, for most of that time, the only option there was. Long before an Englishman ever gave this stretch of water its name though, someone else had already been blown into it more than 50 years earlier and simply never made it back to tell the story properly. The ship that disappeared first. In 1525, a Spanish fleet of 7 ships set out under the command of Garcia Joffre de Loaiza, tasked with reaching the Spice Islands by following the same route Ferdinand Magellan had charted just a few years before. One of those ships was a small vessel called the San Lesmes, commanded by a sailor named Francisco de Hoces. As the fleet approached the eastern entrance of the Strait of Magellan in January of 1526, a gale scattered the ships entirely. 2 were wrecked outright, another turned back for Spain, and the San Lesmes, with Hoces still in command, was driven far south of the strait, down to a latitude of roughly 56 degrees, well past where any European charts extended. What the crew recorded seeing at that latitude was, in their own words at the time, an end of land, open water stretching away where a solid coastline should have continued. It's now widely considered the first time any European had likely laid eyes on the passage that would eventually carry Drake's name, discovered by accident in a storm more than half a century before Drake's own storm would do almost exactly the same thing to him. Hoces eventually managed to work his battered ship back north and rejoin what remained of the expedition. But the story doesn't end there, and it doesn't end well. The San Lesmes continued on with the rest of the fleet toward the Pacific, and by the end of May 1526, she vanished from the historical record entirely. No wreck was ever confirmed. No survivors ever made it home to explain what happened. The ship that may have been the first in history to glimpse the passage between the oceans simply disappeared into the same ocean it had discovered, and to this day, nobody knows exactly where or how. It would be more than 50 years before anyone else stumbled onto that same stretch of water again, and when they finally did, it happened in almost the exact same way. A captain trying desperately to go somewhere else entirely, caught by a storm he never asked for. To this day, Spanish-language maps still occasionally label these waters the Sea of Hoces, a quiet acknowledgement that the Englishman who got the credit wasn't actually the first person to see it. The storm that named the passage. The story of how this stretch of ocean got its name doesn't actually start with someone choosing to sail into it. It starts with an Englishman who was trying his best to avoid it entirely. In 1578, the privateer Francis Drake was partway through what would become the first English circumnavigation of the globe, a voyage that was, underneath its official cover story, essentially a very ambitious and very illegal raiding expedition against Spanish ships and colonies. Drake took his small fleet through the Strait of Magellan, the far safer, more sheltered route that hugs the coastline rather than venturing out into open ocean, and successfully made it through to the Pacific side within about 2 weeks. Then, almost immediately after clearing the strait, the weather turned on him. Drake himself would later describe it as though the heavens themselves had turned hostile, the sky darkening and the wind swinging around to blow directly against everything the fleet was trying to do. A storm hit that didn't last hours. It lasted close to 2 months. One of his ships, the Marigold, was lost entirely, along with everyone aboard. A second, the Elizabeth, was separated from the rest of the fleet during the chaos and turned back for England rather than press on. Drake's own ship, the Golden Hind, was blown so far south and so far off course that he ended up sailing into open water below Tierra del Fuego that no European had ever charted. Water that revealed something nobody had confirmed before, that the landmass at the bottom of South America wasn't connected to some undiscovered southern continent. There was simply open ocean down there, all the way to wherever the ice began. Drake never intended to discover this route. He was blown into it by a storm he was actively trying to survive, and once the weather cleared and he could finally continue his voyage, he had no reason to ever come back this way again. But the open water he'd stumbled into eventually took his name anyway, centuries after the fact, even though the man himself had actually taken the safer path around it. That's the strange origin of the Drake Passage, named after someone who discovered it purely by accident, while frantically trying to avoid exactly the kind of conditions that would go on to define it. For nearly 40 years afterward, nobody deliberately sailed this route on purpose. The Strait of Magellan remained the standard path. That changed with two Dutchmen who had a very specific, very personal reason to find another way through. The men who went looking for it, on purpose. By 1615, the Strait of Magellan wasn't just the safer route between the oceans, it was also a choke point controlled, in practice, by the Dutch East India Company, which held a trading monopoly that made it difficult for independent merchants to legally pass through Magellan's route without running into the company's restrictions. A Dutch merchant named Isaac Lemaire had a financial grudge against that company, having previously been forced out of it after a dispute, and he financed an expedition specifically to find a way around its monopoly, a different route into the Pacific that the company's charter simply hadn't accounted for. His son, Jacob Lemaire, sailed as one of the expedition's leaders, alongside an experienced ship's captain named Willem Schouten. They set out from the Dutch port of Hoorn in 1615 with two ships, the Eendracht and the Hoorn, named after Schouten's hometown, carrying enough provisions for what they expected to be a long and uncertain voyage into waters no chart had ever recorded. Disaster found them almost immediately, though not from the ocean. While the ships were restocking supplies on the coast of Argentina, the Hoorn caught fire and was lost completely, forcing the entire expedition to continue with a single remaining vessel and a noticeably smaller margin for error than they'd planned on having. Undeterred, the Eendracht pressed on south along the coast, and in January of 1616, Schouten and Lemaire found what they were looking for, a stretch of open water south of Tierra del Fuego that nobody had deliberately sailed before, a genuine second route between the oceans that completely bypassed the Strait of Magellan and the Dutch company's monopoly. Along the way, they also charted a narrower channel just to the north of it, which they named the Strait of Lemaire, and confirmed for the first time that Tierra del Fuego was an island rather than the edge of some undiscovered southern continent, a question European mapmakers had been guessing at for decades. They named the headland marking the passage's entrance Cape Horn, after the ship and hometown they'd just lost to fire, and continued on to become only the second expedition in history to successfully sail all the way around the world. It was, by the standards of what would come later, a remarkably clean success. Nobody died crossing the passage itself. The weather cooperated. They'd found their route, and for the moment, it seemed like a triumph. What nobody could have known yet was that they had just opened up a highway that, over the following 3 centuries, would consume roughly 800 ships and take somewhere in the range of 10,000 sailors' lives before anyone thought to build a canal that could avoid it entirely. The Dutch had proven it could be done. What came next were the voyages that proved just how badly it could go. The crossing that was never actually about distance. Here's the part about sailing around Cape Horn that most people get wrong when they first hear about it. The danger was never really about how far the ships had to travel. It was about which direction they were traveling in. Ships sailing from the Atlantic toward the Pacific were sailing directly into the prevailing westerly winds, the same relentless gales that give the Roaring Forties and Furious Fifties their names. A square-rigged sailing ship, built to catch wind from behind or from the side, is remarkably bad at making progress directly against a headwind. Captains attempting this route had to tack back and forth at sharp angles, gaining a small amount of westward progress with each pass, only to potentially lose it again in the next storm that pushed them backward. This is why so many historical accounts of rounding the Horn aren't measured in days. They're measured in weeks, sometimes going on for over a month, with a ship's crew battling the exact same stretch of ocean over and over, gaining a few miles one day and losing them the next, never quite breaking free into the calmer Pacific waters on the other side. Sailors called this fighting for westing, and some ships spent longer trying to gain that westing around Cape Horn than it had taken them to cross the entire Atlantic Ocean to get there in the first place. Life aboard during one of these prolonged crossings settled into a grinding, miserable routine. Crews worked in freezing spray that soaked through oilskins within minutes. hauling on ropes with hands that had gone numb hours earlier, climbing rigging that pitched wildly in every direction, even while anchored to nothing but wind and momentum. Below deck offered little relief, since a ship taking green water over the bow again and again eventually had almost nowhere dry left for exhausted men to sleep. A later captain who served on one of the famous Cape Horn sailing ships would recall being told by his own commanding officer that this stretch of ocean seemed to have been made in anger, and that a sailor's odds of surviving to old age depended entirely on getting the sails trimmed and shortened before the worst of a storm actually arrived. Every extra week spent battling those conditions meant another week of crews exposed to freezing spray, sleeping in perpetually soaked quarters, working exhausted on decks that never stopped moving under them. And in the age before refrigeration or any real understanding of nutrition, every extra week at sea also meant another week without fresh food, which is precisely the condition that let one particular disease turn an already dangerous crossing into a mass grave. The voyage that lost more men than most wars. In 1740, a British naval commander named George Anson set out from England with a squadron of 6 ships and roughly 1,900 men, tasked with rounding Cape Horn to harass Spanish shipping and settlements along the Pacific coast of South America, part of a wider conflict with Spain, known somewhat memorably as the War of Jenkins's Ear. It was, on paper, a straightforward military mission. In practice, it would go on to become one of the deadliest voyages in the entire history of the Royal Navy, and almost none of that death would come from the enemy the mission was actually sent to fight. They reached the entrance to the passage on the 7th of March, 1741, in conditions that briefly looked promising. Anson himself would later write about that deceptive calm before everything fell apart, describing it in his own words from the official account of the voyage as the last cheerful day that the greatest part of us would ever live to enjoy. He wasn't exaggerating for effect. Within days, violent gales from the south slammed into the squadron, and the ships found themselves fighting for westing. For months rather than weeks, pushed backward, scattered from one another, unable to make consistent headway. As the weeks dragged on, the crew's health collapsed. The 18th century Navy's standard treatments for illness at sea, mixtures of vinegar and diluted sulfuric acid among them, did nothing to stop what was actually happening to the men's bodies. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, which, after enough weeks without any fresh food, began causing swollen gums, deep exhaustion, and the reopening of wounds that had healed years earlier. By the time the surviving ships eventually regrouped on the Pacific side of the passage, the squadron had lost several vessels entirely, and something in the range of 1,300 to 1,400 of the roughly 1,900 men who had set out, the overwhelming majority of them to scurvy rather than combat or shipwreck. For comparison, that's a higher death toll than Britain suffered in several entire military campaigns fought around the same period, and almost none of it came from an enemy. It came from a lack of fresh vegetables and a stretch of ocean that simply refused to let the ships pass. But scurvy wasn't just a footnote to the storms. For most of the age of sail, it was the single deadliest thing about rounding Cape Horn. Deadlier than any wreck, and almost nobody at the time had any real idea what was causing it. The sickness that outkilled the storms. Scurvy didn't announce itself right away. It crept in slowly, usually a month or more into a voyage, starting with something that felt like ordinary tiredness and aching joints. Then it got worse. Gums swelled and began to bleed. Bruises appeared on skin that hadn't been struck. Teeth loosened in their sockets. Old wounds and broken bones that had healed years earlier reopened on their own, as though the body itself had simply forgotten how to hold together. 18th century medicine had no idea why. Naval surgeons tried vinegar. They tried a mixture of sulfuric acid and alcohol. They tried laxatives, purges, and treatments rooted in centuries-old theories about balancing bodily fluids that had nothing to do with what was actually happening. None of it worked because the answer wasn't a medicine at all. It was a missing nutrient, vitamin C. a substance that wouldn't even be identified and isolated for another 2 centuries. Without it, the body loses its ability to produce collagen, the protein that holds skin, blood vessels, and connective tissue together, and everything from gums to old scars begins, quite literally, to come apart. One of the stranger and more haunting symptoms doctors of the era documented was a kind of delirium sailors called calenture. Men suffering from advanced scurvy, driven half out of their minds by the disease and by months of exhaustion, would sometimes look out at the open ocean and become utterly convinced it was solid ground, rolling green hills stretching out before them instead of freezing water. Some of them tried to step off the ship and walk onto it. It wasn't until a naval surgeon named James Lind ran a series of comparative trials in 1747, several years after Anson's disastrous crossing, that citrus fruit was conclusively shown to prevent and cure the disease, one of the earliest true clinical experiments in medical history. Even then, it took the better part of another 50 years for the British Navy to fully adopt regular citrus rations for its crews, a small, almost absurdly simple fix for a disease that had been quietly killing more sailors than combat for the better part of 3 centuries. By the time Anson's squadron was fighting for its life off Cape Horn, none of that knowledge existed yet. All his men had were the wrong treatments, the wrong theories, and an ocean that gave them no chance to rest and recover between one gale and the next. Among the ships that never made it to the rendezvous point at all was one that would go on to have arguably the darkest story of the entire expedition, a ship called the Wager, the wreck that became a trial. The Wager was a converted merchant vessel pressed into naval service, carrying supplies and equipment rather than serving as a proper warship, and by the time she reached the entrance of the passage, her crew was already in rough shape. Typhus had swept through the ship during the Atlantic crossing months earlier, and now scurvy was taking hold as well, leaving many of the men aboard barely able to work the sails even before the worst of the weather arrived. As the storms of Cape Horn scattered Anson's squadron in the spring of 1741, one particular swell, among the largest anyone aboard had ever witnessed, swept entirely over the ship's deck and briefly submerged it, washing at least one crew member clean across the quarterdeck. The Wager lost contact with the rest of the fleet entirely in the chaos that followed, and with her sails and rigging battered and her navigation compromised, she ended up dangerously off course, drifting toward the uncharted coastline of southern Chile instead of the open Pacific her captain believed she was approaching. In the early hours of the 14th of May, 1741, with the captain injured from a full days earlier and the crew barely able to manage what remained of the sails, the ship struck rock and ran aground near what's now known as Wager Island, a remote and largely uninhabited stretch of the Chilean coast, its interior a maze of freezing channels, dense forest, and almost no reliable food source for over 100 stranded men. Of the roughly 250 men who had been aboard, about 140 made it to land alive. What followed was not a rescue story. It was closer to a slow unraveling. Stranded with dwindling supplies, a badly damaged environment to forage from, and command structure fracturing under the pressure, the survivors split into factions almost immediately. Some remained loyal to the captain, who insisted on maintaining strict naval discipline even stranded on an unmapped island with no real hope of enforcement. Others argued that the chain of command had effectively ended the moment the ship struck rock, and that survival now depended on abandoning the wreck's rules entirely. Discipline broke down at points, including a confrontation between the captain and one of his own officers that ended with the officer's death, an event that would go on to dominate testimony and disagreement for years afterward. Eventually, most of the group who remained set out in makeshift, modified boats, cobbled together from the wreckage of the Wager itself, to attempt an escape south around the very same Cape Horn that had wrecked them in the first place. An extraordinary journey in vessels barely fit for coastal waters, let alone the open Southern Ocean they'd have to cross to reach any hope of rescue. A separate, smaller group, including the captain, chose to stay behind or attempt a different route entirely, splitting an already broken crew even further apart. Remarkably, a small number of them survived that journey and eventually made it back to England years later, arriving in two separate groups that had taken two entirely different paths off the same island, months and continents apart from each other, each with its own account of what had happened. Multiple, sharply conflicting versions of events followed them home, each survivor's story shading the same handful of days on that island in a different light depending on which faction they'd belonged to. When the surviving officers were finally court-martialed back in Britain, the verdict effectively avoided assigning blame at all, less because nobody had done anything wrong, and more because untangling the truth from years of competing testimony had become close to impossible. The Voyage's story remains one of the starkest illustrations of what this stretch of ocean could do to a ship and a crew even after the wreck itself was over. But by the time large commercial sailing fleets began using this route on a regular basis, a century later, the dangers hadn't disappeared. They'd simply become a routine, calculated cost of doing business. The cost of doing business. By the middle of the 1800s, rounding Cape Horn had become a regular commercial route rather than a rare, dramatic expedition. Fast sailing ships known as clippers made the journey constantly, carrying grain, wool and cargo between Europe, the west coast of the Americas and beyond, racing each other for the fastest possible times on journeys that could otherwise take months. Two particular trades kept ships pouring through this passage year after year. Nitrate, mined out of the deserts of northern Chile and shipped back to Europe to be used in fertilizer and explosives, meant that so many vessels made this same round trip so regularly that they earned their own nickname, the Nitrate Clippers, or simply the Cape Horners. Later, as Australian wheat farms expanded, an annual grain race developed between fully loaded sailing ships racing home from ports like South Australia to Europe, with newspapers back home tracking which captain and crew would round the Horn and cross the finish line first. The men who made a career out of these repeated crossings weren't reckless daredevils looking for a thrill. They were professional sailors doing a job, one that simply happened to run through the most dangerous stretch of ocean on the planet, over and over, voyage after voyage, for years or decades at a stretch. The danger never went away. It simply became something sailors built an entire culture of superstition and ritual around, as a way of coping with a threat that never fully disappeared, no matter how many times a crew successfully made it through. A sailor who had rounded Cape Horn was traditionally entitled to wear a gold earring in his left ear, a visible mark to any other sailor that he'd survived a crossing most people never attempted. Albatrosses, the massive seabirds that trail ships for thousands of miles across the Southern Ocean without ever needing to land, became wrapped in superstition of their own, believed by many crews to carry the souls of sailors who never made it past the Horn, and harming one was considered to invite the very disaster the bird was said to represent. None of that superstition was based on anything a modern scientist would recognize as real, but it reflected something true underneath it. Sailors rounding this passage were engaging in a kind of gamble every single time, one where skill and a well-built ship improved the odds without ever eliminating the danger entirely. Storms could still appear with almost no warning. Waves could still rise up out of nowhere, tall enough to roll a fully loaded ship. And ice, drifting up from the Antarctic side of the passage, added an entirely separate hazard that grew more dangerous the further south a ship was forced by wind or navigation error. By the time all the losses across the age of sail were eventually tallied, historians estimate that somewhere around 800 ships were lost attempting to round Cape Horn and cross the Drake Passage, and something in the range of 10,000 sailors never made it home. A memorial now stands on Cape Horn itself, a steel silhouette of a wandering albatross with a poem by the Chilean poet Sarah Weil engraved nearby. Part of it reads, translated into English, "I am the albatross waiting for you at the end of the world." For roughly 3 centuries, that number kept climbing, one ship and one crew at a time, because there was simply no other way to get a vessel from one ocean to the other without going through this stretch of water or the equally long alternative route around the southern tip of Africa. And storms and scurvy weren't even the only hazard waiting out there. There was also the ice. The danger nobody could see coming. Drifting up from the edge of Antarctica, icebergs and smaller chunks of broken ice, sometimes barely visible above the waterline and known to sailors as growlers, added an entirely separate threat to a passage that was already dangerous enough without them. Unlike a storm, which at least gave a crew some warning as the sky darkened and the barometer dropped, ice could appear with almost none at all. A pale shape, barely distinguishable from white-capped water in poor visibility, closing distance with a wooden hull that had no chance of surviving a direct collision at speed. The ice cover around the passage isn't constant. It grows and shrinks with the seasons, nearly disappearing in the late southern summer and expanding dramatically by the time southern winter sets in, with flows occasionally drifting as far north as Cape Horn itself during the coldest months. For captains already exhausted from weeks of fighting headwinds for a few extra miles of westing, that meant the single stretch of ocean demanding the most alertness was also the one where crews were most likely to be running on the least sleep, scanning a horizon that offered almost nothing to see it coming with. Commercial captains navigating this route through the 1800s and into the early 1900s learned to treat every foggy night below a certain latitude as a potential threat, regardless of how calm the sea itself appeared. Lookouts were posted in conditions that made spotting anything at all nearly impossible, straining to catch the faint white outline of a growler against water that was already white-capped and churning from the wind alone. It was one more variable stacked on top of wind, current, and cold. One more reason a passage that could already take weeks to complete sometimes never got completed at all. Then, in 1914, something changed that made the entire calculation different for the first time in history. When the route finally became optional. The opening of the Panama Canal in 1914 didn't make the Drake Passage any less dangerous. It simply made it possible, for the first time in the history of transoceanic shipping, to avoid it entirely. Cargo vessels moving between the Atlantic and Pacific suddenly had a shorter, calmer, dramatically safer alternative, and commercial traffic through Cape Horn and the Drake Passage collapsed almost immediately. The sailors' graveyard didn't get any gentler. It simply got a lot less crowded because nobody with another option was choosing to sail through it anymore. Even the fastest, best-built ships of the sailing era hadn't been immune to what this route could do right up until that shift happened. Some of the last great commercial sailing vessels still competing on the Cape Horn route in the early 20th century were 4-masted steel barks built specifically to handle exactly these conditions, and even they occasionally spent weeks clawing for westing in weather that hadn't changed even slightly from what Schouten or Anson had faced centuries earlier. The ships had gotten better, the ocean hadn't. That didn't mean the passage stopped claiming attention entirely. Recreational sailors continued attempting it as one of the great remaining challenges in the sport, a kind of open water proving ground still compared, even today, to summiting one of the world's tallest mountains. Naturalist Charles Darwin himself sailed near these waters aboard HMS Beagle in the 1830s and came close to disaster in the same violent conditions that had already claimed so many others, describing towering waves that nearly overwhelmed the ship's smaller boats during a survey of the coastline nearby, decades before his voyage would go on to shape an entirely different field of science altogether. Today, the ships crossing the Drake Passage are overwhelmingly expedition vessels carrying tourists toward Antarctica, built with stabilizers, weather forecasting, and satellite communication that 18th century sailors could never have imagined. Modern crews still talk about the passage in 2 distinct moods, jokingly nicknamed the Drake Lake on the rare calm crossings and the Drake Shake on the frequent rough ones. A small piece of gallows humor passed down, whether anyone realizes it or not, from centuries of sailors who faced far worse odds with far less warning. Even now, with all of that technology on board, a rough crossing can still mean days of severe seasickness and the occasional broken piece of furniture, a small, watered-down echo of what this same stretch of ocean used to do to entire fleets. The wind hasn't slowed down. The Antarctic circumpolar current still moves more water than anywhere else on the planet, funneling endlessly through that same 600-mile gap where two continents almost, but never quite, touch. What's changed isn't the ocean, it's everything human beings built to survive crossing it, layered one hard-earned lesson at a time, on top of the wrecks and the scurvy and the months spent fighting for a single mile of westing that the sea would just as easily take back the next day. Every one of the people in this story arrived at that stretch of water carrying more confidence than the ocean was ultimately willing to respect. Joses thought he was still following Magellan's charted route until the storm proved otherwise. Drake thought he'd already survived the hard part once he cleared the strait. Anson's navigators believed their charts were accurate enough to judge exactly how far west they'd actually traveled, an error in judgment that cost hundreds of men their lives before anyone realized the maps themselves were wrong. Every single miscalculation in its own way came from the same source, an ocean that simply refused to behave the way the available information said it should. Every ship that makes the crossing now, calm or violent, is still sailing through the same stretch of water that swallowed the Marigold, scattered Anson's squadron, and left the Voyager broken apart on a coastline nobody had charted. The gap between the continents is exactly where it's always been. The only thing standing between a modern traveler and everything this video just described is roughly 300 years of other people's mistakes, paid for one wrecked ship at a time. If you found this as fascinating as we did putting it together, hit like on this video and subscribe for more deep dives just like it.